Imagine being chosen to birth the future, only to be discarded like trash in the desert. This isn't just the story of a slave. It is a mirror for anyone who has ever felt used and thrown away. Stay to watch how Hagar, the invisible woman, found God exactly where the religion of Abraham failed. Wait to see the shocking twist. Why does the God who promises also allow the expulsion? We will dive deep into the psychology of abandonment and discover the secret that transformed a desperate single mother into the matriarch of nations. Don't miss the revelation of El Roy, the God who sees, and how he opens wells where we see only death. If you have ever felt like the secondary character in someone else's story, this video was made for you. Prepare to have your vision unlocked. This is the Bible teaches. The crushing silence of the Beersheba desert is broken only by the dry sob of a woman who has just committed the most unnatural act a mother can perform. Abandoning her own child under a twisted bush because she no longer has the courage to watch him die. Hagar stumbles away from the child, a bowshot's distance away, feeling the heat of the sand burning through her worn sandals. But this physical pain is irrelevant compared to the internal hemorrhage of her rejected soul. The water skin is empty, dry and wrinkled like her own hopes, a silent witness to the human cruelty that has placed her in this death sentence without trial. She is not just a lost traveler. She is the discarded trash of a family chosen by God, the spare piece that was used to build a promise and then thrown away when the official piece arrived. The image of this Egyptian woman, sitting alone in the barren vastness, weeping loudly so as not to hear the faltering breath of her son Ishmael, is the definitive portrait of human desolation. That terrible moment when all the doors of the earth have closed and the sky seems to be made of impenetrable bronze. We look at Hagar and see the ghost of all the excluded, of all the people who were useful for a season and then dismissed from someone's life with the coldness of a commercial transaction, left to evaporate in the desert of oblivion while the chosen ones celebrate their banquets in safe tents. It is terrifying to realize that this tragedy was not caused by pagan enemies, but by the family of faith, by Abraham and Sarah, proving that sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted precisely by those who claim to know God, but who, under the pressure of convenience, choose to sacrifice people to preserve their own domestic peace. The journey that led Hagar to this breaking point began much earlier, in the cold corridors of manipulation, when she was stripped of her identity and reduced to a surrogate womb to resolve the faith crisis of an impatient couple. She saw Sarah, the barren matriarch, look at her not as a human being with dreams and fears, but as a biological tool, a resource to be exploited to ensure the offspring that God seemed slow to send. Hagar's pregnancy, which should have been a moment of glory, became her curse, as the growth of her womb only increased her mistress's contempt, creating a domestic war where the servant had no chance of victory. Hagar learned the hard way that proximity to power does not guarantee protection. On the contrary, it makes you the easiest target for the insecurities of the powerful. When Ishmael was born, she may have thought her position would be secure, that the blood of Abraham running in the boy's veins would be a shield against rejection. But the arrival of Isaac, years later, transformed the son of the solution into the son of the problem, and the innocent laughter of two children playing was reinterpreted by Sarah's envy as a threat to inheritance that needed to be eradicated. The expulsion was not only physical, it was an emotional amputation. Abraham, the man of God, rose at dawn, not to defend his son, but to deliver them to death with a little bread and a skin of water, a ridiculous provision for those about to cross hell. Hagar carries on her shoulders not only the weight of the meager supplies, but the weight of the betrayal of a father who chose harmony with his wife over the life of his son. a pain that resonates in the heart of anyone who has ever been overlooked, replaced or forgotten by those who should have loved them. However, it is precisely at the epicenter of this abandonment, when the water runs out and death begins to circle like a patient vulture, that Hagar's theology is forged in the fire. Years earlier, in her first flight to the desert, she had already had an encounter that changed the history of religion. She was the first person in the Bible, man or woman, free or enslaved, to give God a name. She called him El Roi, the God who sees me. Now, in the second crisis, when her eyes are blinded by tears and despair, heaven responds not to the theology of Abraham, but to the cry of the boy Ishmael. The angel of God cries out from the heavens, not to rebuke the desperate mother, but to open her eyes to a reality that pain had hidden. "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid." The divine question cuts through the noise of panic and redirects her attention. God opens Hagar's eyes, and suddenly she sees a well of water that was probably there all along, but which her anguish prevented her from seeing. The blindness of grief is as dangerous as the blindness of pride. It makes us believe that the resource has run out, that the end has come, when God's provision is only a few meters away, hidden by the curtain of our tears. Hagar fills the skin, gives the boy a drink, and in that simple act, she defeats the death decreed by Sarah and Abraham. She rises from the ground no longer as the rejected slave, but as the matriarch of a nation, the woman who survived the cruelty of the saints to find the goodness of the Creator. Hagar's story is an eternal reminder that being invisible to men is often the prerequisite for being seen by God, and that He has the strange and wonderful habit of building great kingdoms with the stones that human builders rejected. To understand the depth of the strength that sustained Hagar in that final moment of rupture, we need to rewind the tape of history and return to the silent corridors of Abraham's tent years before, where the poison of rejection began to be distilled drop by drop. Hagar's tragedy did not begin in the desert. It began with the success of a human plan that attempted to aid God's sovereignty. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere of a home where faith mingled with carnal strategy, where Hagar was promoted from servant to surrogate wife not out of love, but out of bureaucratic utility. When her belly began to grow, occupying the space that Sarah's belly could not fill, something fundamental broke in the dynamics of that sacred home. Hagar, perhaps intoxicated by the sudden importance her body had acquired, looked at her mistress with the instinctive contempt of someone who finally feels they possess something that the other's money and position cannot buy. This contempt was not merely arrogance, it was the silent cry of someone who, all her life, had been invisible and suddenly found herself carrying the future of the tribe in her womb. However, Sarah's reaction was devastating, using her authority to transform the Egyptian woman's life into a domestic hell so unbearable that the desert, with its snakes and scorpions, seemed like paradise compared to the tent of her masters. Hagar's first escape, recorded in Genesis 16, is not the flight of a rebel, but the desperate exodus of a woman who preferred to die free in the sand than to live enslaved in the bitterness of another. She runs toward Shur on the way to Egypt, instinctively trying to return home to the roots of her former identity, fleeing the promised land, which for her had become the land of affliction. It is in this scene of flight, near a water source on the road to Shur, that the most extraordinary and subversive theological event of the Old Testament takes place, an encounter that breaks all the protocols of patriarchal religion. The angel of the Lord, a direct manifestation of the divinity, meets Hagar. Note the verb. He finds God didn't wait for her to reach a sanctuary or for Abraham to intercede for her. He went after the runaway slave like a shepherd seeks a lost sheep. The question the angel asks is surgical and dismantles any attempt at self-deception. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? By calling her by name and function, God forces her to face the reality from which she is fleeing. He doesn't treat her with the condescension of a helpless victim, but with the dignity of a moral agent who needs to take responsibility for her own path. Hagar answers with brutal honesty, "I am fleeing from Sarai's presence, mistress." There is no complex theology here, only the stark truth of a wounded woman. And it is then that God gives her an order that seems at first glance cruel and contradictory. Return to your mistress and submit to her. Why would God send someone back to the place of abuse? Because he knew that premature flight would only abort the greater purpose that was being conceived within her. God was not endorsing Sarah's cruelty, but was forging Hagar's resilience, teaching her that true freedom is not geographical, but internal. He needed her to return not to be destroyed, but so that Ishmael could be born within the covenant, protected by the promise, even if marginalized by his family. But the climax of this encounter is not in the order to return, but in the revelation Hagar receives about who God is. Faced with the promise that her descendants would be innumerable, Hagar does something that no theologian, priest, or patriarch had done until then. She gives God a name. In an act of unprecedented spiritual boldness, this Egyptian woman, a slave and fugitive, looks to the sky and says, "You are El Roi, the God who sees me." The depth of this declaration is abysmal. Until that moment, God was El Shaddai, Almighty, or Elohim and Creator, titles of power and majesty. But Hagar, in the solitude of her grief, discovers a facet of God that Abraham did not yet know, the facet of intimacy, of loving vigilance, of the gaze that penetrates social invisibility. She exclaims in wonder, "Have I not also seen the one who sees me?" Hagar realizes that all the while she felt like an object in Sarah's tent, God was watching her. When she cried in secret while serving at the table, God was watching her. When she ran through the desert thinking she was alone, God was watching her. This discovery heals the orphanhood of her soul. She understands that she doesn't need to be the official chosen one to be loved, nor does she need to be the patriarch's wife to have access to heaven. Hagar's theology is the theology of the marginalized, the certainty that God's gaze is not filtered by status, race, or gender. She returns to Sarah's tent no longer as the humiliated slave, but as the woman who carries a secret. She saw God and survived. This secret strength, born near the spring on the road to Shur, is what allowed her to endure the following years of silence and, eventually, survive the final expulsion we narrated in the previous chapter. Hagar's return to Abraham's house marks the beginning of a silent incubation period that would last more than a decade, a time when pride was ground down and faith was tested in the monotonous routine of submission. Imagine the strength of character needed to serve daily the woman who despises you, carrying in your womb and then in your arms the living proof of the conflict, and yet still maintain the dignity of one who knows she is seen by the Almighty. Ishmael grows up in this tense environment, absorbing the wild resilience of his mother and the distant indifference of his father. The angel's prophecy about the boy being like a wild donkey, with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, is not a curse, but a description of radical freedom. God was promising Hagar that her son would never be domesticated, never a slave of the soul, as she was forced to be. He would be free, untamed, a man of the desert who bows to no one. This promise fueled Hagar during the slow years. She watched the boy running through the fields and saw not a rejected bastard, but a nation in seed, a fulfillment of the word of that God who sees. Hagar's true strength was not only surviving physical thirst, but surviving the thirst for justice, trusting that the judge of all the earth was keeping the correct account, and that in due time he would set her free, not through cowardly flight, but through divine emancipation, even if that emancipation came disguised as a painful expulsion. She teaches us that sometimes the path to the throne passes through captivity, and that whoever has God's promise in their heart can endure any temporary hell, for they know that the last word will never be given by the oppressor. The tension simmering beneath the surface of Abraham's tent finally explodes on what should have been a day of pure celebration: Isaac's weaning feast. Imagine the scene. The patriarch, now a centenarian, throws a grand banquet to celebrate the survival of his son of promise, the boy who defied biology and proved God's faithfulness. Laughter, music, and abundance fill the camp, but in the corners of the feast, watchful eyes observe. Sarah, the triumphant mother, cannot relax. Her joy is marred by the constant presence of the other woman and her teenage son Ishmael, who is now about 14 years old. The biblical text says that Sarah saw Hagar's son mocking or playing. The Hebrew word is ambiguous, but for Sarah there was no ambiguity whatsoever. What she saw was not sibling play, but a threat of usurpation. That strong and wild teenager represented everything she feared: the possibility that Isaac's inheritance would be divided, diluted, or stolen. Maternal jealousy, mixed with theological insecurity, triggers the final blow. Sarah marches to Abraham with an ultimatum that leaves no room for negotiation. Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit with my son Isaac. Note the brutal dehumanization in Sarah's language. She doesn't use their names. Hagar is this slave woman. Ishmael is the son of the slave woman. To expel them, she first needs to strip them of their humanity, transforming people into problems that can be discarded like trash in the desert. Abraham finds himself paralyzed in the midst of this domestic storm, anguished by the pain of having to amputate his own son from his life. However, the divine intervention that follows is one of the most disconcerting in the Bible. God tells Abraham, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your servant girl. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you." At first glance, it seems that God is sanctioning Sarah's cruelty, validating the petty jealousy of an insecure wife. But if we look through the lens of providence, we will realize that God was working a liberation disguised as expulsion. As long as Hagar remained in Abraham's tent, she would eternally be the slave, and Ishmael would always be the other woman's son, living in Isaac's shadow, tolerated but never celebrated. Abraham's tent had become too small to contain two distinct nations. God needed to expel Hagar, not to destroy her, but to emancipate her. Freedom often arrives in our lives dressed in the frightening garb of rejection. Being fired, being left behind, being expelled, these traumatic events are frequently the violent way God cuts the cords that bound us to places where our growth was stagnant. Hagar needed to step out of Sarah's shadow to become the matriarch she was destined to be. She sets out that cold morning with bread and water on her shoulders, thrust out of the relative comfort of slavery into the terrifying insecurity of freedom, unaware that she was walking toward her own empire. And so we return to the crisis of the first chapter, but now with the resolution that God's vision brings. When Hagar opens her eyes and sees the well of water, the well that was there all along, invisible only to her despair, the story takes a definitive turn. She and Ishmael drink, survive, and most importantly, do not return. Unlike the first escape, where the angel ordered their return, this time there is no order to go back. The break is final. They settle in the desert of Paran, a harsh and free land, where Ishmael becomes a skilled archer, fulfilling the prophecy of being an indomitable man. But the true conclusion of Hagar's strength is revealed in a final detail, almost a footnote, which carries immense sociological weight. And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. It was not Abraham who chose the wife for the firstborn, as was the absolute patriarchal custom of the time. It was Hagar. She assumes the role of head of the family, of sovereign matriarch. She returns to her Egyptian roots to seek her son's future, closing the cycle of her own story and ensuring the continuity of her lineage far from the toxic influence of her former masters. Hagar, the discarded slave, ends the narrative as a free woman, mother of princes, the only character in all of Scripture who had the audacity to name God and the strength to build a life upon the ashes of rejection. The story of Hagar is a mirror for all who feel secondary in someone else's story. It teaches us that God is not the exclusive property of the Abrahams and Sarahs of this world. He is the God of the marginalized, the refugees, and the single mothers who weep in the desert. It proves that God's blessing is not restricted to the official lineage and that He can make a great nation spring up even outside the promised land. Hagar invites us to wipe away our tears, to see the wells that God has opened in the midst of our desert, reminding us that when men close the tent door, God opens the windows of heaven. She survived to tell us that it doesn't matter who rejected us on earth, as long as He who lives in heaven knows our name and sees us. Hagar's secret strength was not her resistance to pain, but her ability to find God outside of institutionalized religion, on the beaten ground of real life, and there, in the middle of nowhere, discover that she had everything. To understand the chasm that separates Hagar from her masters, we must first strip the biblical narrative of its apparent simplicity and delve into the cultural complexity that Hagar carried in her very name. Jewish tradition in the Midrashim suggests that Hagar was not an ordinary slave bought in a human flesh market, but an Egyptian princess, daughter of Pharaoh, who was given to Sarah as a servant after the disastrous incident in which Abraham descended into Egypt fleeing famine. Imagine the psychological weight of this transition. A woman raised in the stone and gold palaces of the Nile, accustomed to the worship of visible gods and the stability of a millennial empire, suddenly torn from her world and reduced to servitude to a nomadic clan living in goat-hair tents and worshipping an invisible god. Hagar carries in her memory the scent of the lotus and the stability of the pyramids, and now her days are consumed by the dust of Canaan and the whims of a barren mistress. This cultural baggage is fundamental to understanding her stance. She does not possess the mind of a born slave, but the wounded pride of a lost nobility. When the Bible says she despised her mistress, we are not seeing merely the arrogance of a pregnant woman, but the resurgence of a true identity that had been stifled under years of forced obedience. Hagar looked upon Sarah not only as her mistress, but as a woman of an inferior culture, a nomad without a fixed land, while she, Hagar, carried in her blood the glory of the greatest civilization on earth. This clash of cultures, Egypt versus Canaan, the empire versus the tent, is the invisible foundation upon which all future tragedy would be built. We often ignore the past of the people who enter our story, treating them only based on the function they perform for us in the present, without realizing that each human being is a complex universe of memories, traumas, and lost dignities that, if not respected, will eventually explode into conflict. Life in Abraham's tent, before the pregnancy crisis, was marked by an architecture of silence. Hagar learned the art of becoming invisible, the skill necessary for every servant to be present without being there. She knew Sarah's moods by the way she stirred the flour or by the tone of voice when giving a simple order. She witnessed the early mornings when Sarah wept over the cultural shame of her infertility, listening through the thin curtains of the tent to the whispered discussions between the patriarch and his wife about God's promise that seemed to have forgotten their address. Hagar was the silent spectator of Abraham's theology failing in practice. She saw the man who built altars and spoke with the eternal, unable to console the bitterness of his own wife. This daily witness to the human frailty of her spiritual leaders generated in Hagar a kind of pragmatic skepticism. She served Abraham's God out of obligation, but in her heart that God seemed distant, elitist, and focused only on her master's lineage. How many of us in our religious or family environments are like Hagar, silent observers of the contradictions of those who claim to have faith? We see the discrepancy between the public discourse of confidence and the private panic of doubt, and this creates in us a cynical barrier that prevents us from experiencing God for ourselves until, as we shall see, pain forces us to seek an experience that is not second-hand. The day Sarah summoned Hagar to propose the surrogacy plan was not a day of hope, but of a cold and desperate commercial transaction. The Bible describes the scene with an economy of words that hides the emotional violence of the moment. Behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, therefore take my servant. Sarah does not ask Hagar if she agrees. She does not ask for her opinion or her consent. She disposes of Hagar's body as one disposes of an animal from the flock for a necessary sacrifice. Hagar is called to the center of the tent, and there, under the assessing gaze of her mistress, she realizes that her humanity is being completely dissolved in favor of a biological function. She would cease to be a person to become a vessel. Sarah's proposal reveals the darkest facet of human impatience, the willingness to use people as tools to help God fulfill his promises. Sarah was tired of waiting for the supernatural miracle, so she decided to fabricate an artificial miracle using the flesh of another person. At that moment, Hagar felt the crushing weight of her lack of choice. As a slave, her body did not belong to her. Her womb was the property of her masters. She was given to Abraham as a woman, the text says, but this promotion was in fact the deepest form of violation. She was forced into loveless intimacy, a union without covenant, all to satisfy the wounded ego of a woman who could no longer bear the stigma of being barren. The night Hagar was taken to Abraham's tent is the blind spot in the biblical narrative, the awkward moment of silence that theology often avoids discussing. There was no romance, no conquest, no sweetness of mutual consent. There was only the fulfillment of a biological duty carried out under the heavy shadow of Sarah's expectation, who probably waited outside or in the next tent, monitoring the outcome of that forced union. Hagar lay with an old man, her mistress's husband, carrying in her heart the toxic mixture of fear, resignation, and perhaps a seed of vengeful ambition. For it is in forced intimacy that power dynamics begin to shift. Hagar realized that although Sarah held the title, it was she, Hagar, who possessed the vitality. Although Sarah had the promise, it was she, Hagar, who had the real possibility. On that dark night, while Abraham's seed was planted in her womb, another seed was planted in Hagar's soul, the seed of superiority. She understood that if she bore a child, she would have something Sarah could never take from her. The tragedy of this conception is that it was conceived in the flesh to solve a problem of the spirit, and everything born only of the flesh and human manipulation carries with it the DNA of conflict. Hagar left that tent the next morning no longer as the invisible servant, but as the bearer of the future, and the look she cast upon Sarah changed forever. We need to be terribly careful with the alternative solutions we create for our lives, because when we use people to fill the holes in our faith, we create emotional monsters that sooner or later will turn against us to devour us. Hagar's pregnancy was not merely a biological process, it was a political revolution within the camp. As her body changed, the geography of power in Abraham's household underwent an earthquake. Hagar's morning sickness was, paradoxically, her moment of greatest triumph, the physical proof that she had achieved what the great matriarch had failed to do in decades of marriage. Hagar began to walk through the camp with a new posture. The curvature of her spine, trained by years of submission, straightened to balance the weight of her belly, but also to balance the new weight of her ego. She stopped lowering her eyes when Sarah passed by. For the first time in her life, Hagar felt chosen, not by the God of Abraham perhaps, but by nature, by biology, by life. This intoxication of fertility is an understandable but dangerous human reaction. Hagar fell into the trap of confusing the blessing of the gift, the child, with the approval of her character or position. She believed that her ability to give life made her better than the woman who could not. The contempt she began to harbor against Sarah was not verbal. A slave could not afford such a luxury, but it was atmospheric. It was in the impatient sigh, the lingering gaze, the protective way she clutched her belly whenever Sarah was nearby, as if to say, "Here is what you cannot have." Hagar used her blessing as a weapon, transforming the miracle of life into an instrument of psychological torture against her mistress. Sarah, in turn, reacted with the fury of someone betrayed by her own invention. She looked at Hagar's belly and didn't see Abraham's son. She saw the failure of her own body and the insolence of her servant. The Bible says that Sarah afflicted Hagar. The Hebrew term is the same one used to describe the oppression of the Israelites by the Egyptians years later. It wasn't just verbal reprimand, it was physical abuse, excessive work, public humiliation. Sarah tried to break Hagar's spirit, tried to force her back to her insignificance through pain. Imagine the cruelty of forcing a pregnant woman to carry heavy loads, to work under the scorching sun, denying her rest and adequate food, all in a desperate attempt to reaffirm who was in charge. The house of Abraham, the man of faith, became a war zone where two women fought not only for position, but for the very definition of their worth. Abraham, God's great diplomat, failed miserably as a husband and father, washing his hands and saying to Sarah, "Your servant is in your hand. Do to her whatever seems good to you." This cowardly omission by Abraham was the final blow for Hagar. She realized there was no human justice for her. The father of her son would not protect her. The religion of that family did not include mercy for outsiders. It was this perception of total orphanhood that pushed her to her first escape. Hagar preferred to risk death in the desert rather than continue living under the boot of a religious hypocrisy that preached love for God but practiced hatred for one's neighbor. Hagar's flight teaches us that there is a limit to what the human soul can endure, and that dignity sometimes demands that we walk towards the dangerous unknown instead of remaining in the abusive known. Hagar's solitude on the road to Shur during her first flight is one of the most underrated scenes in Scripture in terms of psychological density. She is pregnant, walking towards Egypt, a suicidal route for a woman alone and without adequate provisions. Every step Hagar takes is a protest. She is voting with her feet against Abraham's system. But the desert, in its silent vastness, begins to work a deconstruction within her. Far from Sarah's commanding voices and Abraham's passivity, Hagar begins to hear the sound of her own thoughts and eventually the sound of God. It is fascinating to note that the angel of the Lord finds her by a spring of water. Hagar instinctively sought life, water in the midst of death, desert. There, sitting exhausted and dirty, she must have questioned everything. Is life worth living? Is it worth bringing this child into a world that has already rejected it before it is born? The dialogue with the angel is not merely a geographical directive, go back. It is a session of divine intensive therapy. God validates her pain by asking, "Where do you come from?" allowing her to verbalize her trauma. "I am fleeing from Sarai." Divine psychology understands that healing begins with the confession of the wound. God does not minimize her suffering by saying, "It's nothing serious." He acknowledges her flight, but redirects her destiny. The command to return and humble oneself is perhaps the most difficult test God ever imposed on anyone in the Bible. He was asking Hagar to return to captivity voluntarily. Why? Because God knew that Ishmael needed the protection of Abraham's household, even if it was flawed protection, to survive his vulnerable early years. God was teaching Hagar the difference between strategic submission and defeat. Returning didn't mean Sarah had won. It meant Hagar had a greater mission to protect the seed she carried. The promise God makes to Hagar, "I will surely multiply your descendants," is the key that unlocks her mind. God gives Hagar, a slave, the same promise he gave to Abraham. He places her on an equal spiritual footing with the patriarch regarding the future. Hagar returns to the tent not because Sarah commanded her, but because God promised. She returns empowered. The humiliation at Sarah's hands would now be bearable because Hagar knew something Sarah didn't. The future of that child was guaranteed by God himself. This theology of survival is what sustains millions of people today who need to remain in difficult jobs, complicated marriages, or unjust situations for a time, not because they are weak, but because they have a promise and a purpose that demand strategic patience. Hagar teaches us the art of losing the present to gain the future. The period between Ishmael's birth and Isaac's birth is a narrative void of 13 years, where the Bible records not a single word from God to Abraham. 13 years of divine silence, but for Hagar, these were the golden years. During this time, Ishmael was the only son. Abraham, already old, clung to the boy with the fierceness of one who believes this is his last chance for a legacy. Hagar watched her son grow in the patriarch's lap. She saw Abraham teach Ishmael to ride, to hunt, to worship. She saw the gleam of pride in the old man's eyes when he looked at the wild boy. In those years, Hagar must have thought she had won. Sarah grew old, dry and bitter, while Ishmael flourished, full of life and vigor. Hagar's tent, though still a servant's tent, became the center of the household's vitality. She created a routine of stability based on the logical assumption that Isaac would never come. Hagar's faith was solidified by what her eyes saw. Ishmael was the rightful heir. She built her security upon this visible reality. However, this peace was a fragile illusion, built on God's silence, not on his final word. Hagar made the human mistake of confusing God's plan B, blessing Ishmael, with plan A, the covenant through Isaac. She settled for the provisional blessing. When the angels visited Abraham in the oaks of Mamre to announce that Sarah would have a son, Hagar's world began to silently crumble. Isaac's birth was not just a miracle, it was Hagar's personal apocalypse. Suddenly, in a single day, 13 years of status were erased. Ishmael was demoted from only son to son of the slave woman again. Hagar's pain in this second phase was not the pain of newness, but the pain of loss. It is far more painful to lose what you thought was already yours than to have never had it. The tension that led to the final expulsion, narrated earlier, stemmed from Hagar's unprocessed grief and Ishmael's identity confusion, who went from crown prince to unwanted burden. The cruelty of the final expulsion was the inevitable climax of a decade of misunderstandings, proving that we cannot build our identity on temporary foundations. For when God moves the pieces of history to fulfill his eternal purpose, everything that is not a true foundation crumbles. Hagar had to lose her position in Abraham's tent to find her true place in the desert of Paran, no longer as the mother of the substitute heir, but as the mother of a free and independent nation. The birth of Isaac was not merely an obstetric event, it was a theological cataclysm that rewrote Hagar's reality. Imagine the day the cry of a newborn baby broke the air in Sarah's tent, a sound Hagar believed to be biologically impossible. That cry was the sound of the end of the world for Hagar. During Sarah's pregnancy, Hagar may have clung to the cynical hope that, given the woman's advanced age, 90 years, the child would not survive, or that it would only be a psychological pregnancy. But when Isaac, whose name means laughter, took his first breath, the divine joke was complete at the cost of Ishmael's tragedy. The camp, which for 13 years had revolved around Ishmael like the son of Abraham, suddenly shifted its orbit. Hagar saw the servants, who had previously treated her with the respect due to the mother of the heir, now rushing to Sarah's tent with gifts and adoration. She felt the change in the atmosphere. She and her son had become instantly obsolete. The cruelty of that moment lies in the fact that no one did it out of direct malice. It was the simple and brutal substitution of good for better. Ishmael had done nothing wrong. Hagar had not failed in her duties, but the arrival of the true promise made the substitute promise unnecessary. Hagar watched Abraham hold Isaac. The patriarch's gaze toward this new baby was different. With Ishmael, there was the pride of virility, the joy of having a son in old age. But with Isaac there was astonishment. Hagar saw Abraham touch Isaac's face as if he were touching the very face of God. That child was a supernatural miracle, while her son was merely a natural product. This spiritual distinction created an insurmountable chasm. Hagar realized that her son was a child of the flesh, born of the will of man, while Isaac was a child of the Spirit, born of the promise. Theologically, this is powerful. Humanly, it is devastating. Hagar had to console Ishmael, now a confused teenager, explaining why his father no longer had time for hunting lessons, why the admiring glances had vanished. She had to manage the rejection of a 14-year-old boy who was being erased from the family photo in real time. Hagar's bitterness at this stage was not explosive, but corrosive. She began to see God not as the El Roi, who saw her in the desert, but as a capricious God who played with human lives, giving and taking away status according to his mysterious will. Hagar's faith silently collapsed, setting the stage for the final conflict. She barricaded herself in her tent, creating an emotional ghetto where only she and Ishmael existed, united against the world of laughter that echoed outside, laughter that to them sounded like mockery. The day Isaac was weaned, likely when he was about 3 years old, was the tipping point. Abraham ordered a colossal feast. It wasn't just a celebration of growth, it was public confirmation that Isaac had survived infant mortality, the most dangerous phase of antiquity. He was viable, he was the future. Hagar was forced to attend, to wear her best clothes and smile while her heart bled. And there, amidst the music and wine, the incident occurred. The Bible says Sarah saw Ishmael playing. Paul in Galatians interprets this as persecuting or mocking. Let's analyze the scene with a microscope. Ishmael is 17 years old. Isaac is 3. Ishmael is a young, strong man from the desert. Isaac is a frail baby. Perhaps Ishmael was just play fighting as brothers do. Perhaps he was laughing, the baby, in an adolescent attempt to diminish the one who stole his place. Or perhaps, and this is more likely, he was acting like the firstborn, displaying his natural strength and authority. What matters is not what Ishmael did, but what Sarah did. It saw. The text says, Sarah saw that the son of Hagar the Egyptian. She didn't see Ishmael. She saw the son of the Egyptian woman. The filter of prejudice transformed an innocent or immature action into an existential threat. Sarah saw in Ishmael's strength the danger to Isaac's weakness. She realized that if Abraham died at that moment, Ishmael, by natural law and physical strength, would dominate the clan. Sarah's maternal protective instinct merged with her theological arrogance. She didn't see a nephew or a stepson. She saw a rival. That look from Sarah, crossing the courtyard of the feast, was the true mortal blow. Hagar, on the other side, intercepted that look. Mothers know that look. It's the look that says, "There's no room for both of you in this world." Hagar felt a chill down her spine, the certainty that tolerance had ended. The feast, which was meant to celebrate life, became the court where Hagar's social death sentence was signed. She pulled Ishmael close, not to reprimand him, but to protect him, knowing that the Cold War had heated up and that Sarah's next move would be decisive. We underestimate the power of a judgmental look. It can shatter a person's security faster than any words. At that moment, the party music stopped for Hagar, and she heard only the sound of the clock counting down the final minutes of her stay at Abraham's house. The night following the feast was the longest of Abraham's life. Sarah issued her ultimatum. Cast out that slave girl. The Hebrew word for cast out, garash, is violent. It suggests a forced divorce, an aggressive expulsion. Abraham was in agony. The text says that it was very grievous in Abraham's eyes. He loved Ishmael. That boy was his flesh and blood, his first proof of fatherhood, his companion of 13 years. To expel him was to amputate a limb from his own body. Abraham probably argued with Sarah, tried to negotiate, tried to propose intermediate solutions, but Sarah was unyielding. The patriarchal couple's room became a chamber of debate about the fate of two souls. Hagar, in her tent, embracing Ishmael, awaited the verdict, hearing the echoes of the discussion, feeling the terror of utter impotence. Then God intervenes, and the intervention is shocking. God says to Abraham, "Do not be angry. Listen to Sarah's voice." God takes sides. Why? Not because Sarah was morally superior, her motive was jealousy, but because the divine purpose demanded separation. God knew that Ishmael would never be who he was meant to be, a free nation, if he continued living in Isaac's shadow. And Isaac would never be who he was meant to be, the bearer of the peace covenant, if he had to fight against Ishmael's dominance. The separation was surgical and necessary for the health of both destinies. But to Abraham, at that moment, it seemed only cruelty. God promised that he would also make Ishmael a nation, because he is your offspring. This promise was the only anesthetic that allowed Abraham to perform the amputation. He had to trust that God would take care of the son he was expelling. Abraham's faith was tested here as much as it would be tested on Mount Moriah. On Moriah, he would have to deliver Isaac to death. Here, he had to deliver Ishmael into the desert. Both were sacrifices. Abraham rose at dawn while it was still dark, his heart broken, to fulfill the most painful command of his domestic life. He did not wake the servants. He himself prepared the provisions in a final act of service and mourning. That night teaches us that sometimes God's will comes wrapped in decisions that tear our hearts apart, and that necessary separation often hurts more than misguided union. The dawn of that day cast a gray and somber light over the Beersheba camp. Abraham entered Hagar's tent before the sun had fully risen. The silence between them must have been deafening. What do you say to a woman you've lived with for years, who gave you a son, and whom you are now sending away to die? Abraham has no recorded speeches. His actions speak of contained grief and terrible resignation. He took bread and a skin of water. Let's pause here. Abraham was a nomadic prince, extremely rich in cattle, gold, and silver. Why did he give them only that? Why not a donkey? Why not an armed escort? Why not a tent? Some commentators suggest he wanted them to depend entirely on God. Others, more cynical, say Sarah may have forbidden him from giving them inheritance goods. But the visual image is devastating. The richest man in the region sends his son away with a poor man's lunchbox. He placed the skin on her shoulder. The physical weight of the water was symbolic of the weight of responsibility he was transferring. From that moment on, Ishmael's life rested entirely on Hagar's shoulders. Abraham was abdicating his fatherhood. Hagar couldn't resist. There's no record of screams, pleas, or scandals. Perhaps her Egyptian dignity prevented her from begging a man who had chosen another woman. Perhaps she was in shock. She woke Ishmael, now a tall, strong, but confused young man. The boy looked at his father, perhaps hoping for an explanation, a hug, a blessing. What he received was silence and a turned back. Abraham dismissed her. He opened the camp door and pointed toward the desert. That sound, the creaking of the door or the tent flap closing behind them, was the final sound of an era. Hagar and Ishmael took their first step onto the cold morning sand, leaving behind safety, food, shelter, and the God of Abraham. They walked without looking back, because looking back would turn them into a pillar of salt made of tears. Hagar walked with her spine straight while within sight of the camp. But as soon as the dunes hid the tents, the weight of the world collapsed upon her. She was now a single mother, unemployed, homeless and stateless, in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The cruelty of that morning lies in the banality with which lives are discarded. The sun rose. The servants began to work. Sarah smiled in her tent, and two people were erased from the community's existence as if they had never mattered. The journey through the Beersheba desert was not a straight line to Egypt. It was a circular wandering. The text says she was wandering aimlessly. The desert is a labyrinth of mirages where all directions seem the same. Hagar lost her way. The panic of not knowing where to go consumes energy and water faster than physical walking. Imagine the deadly accounting Hagar did with each sip. How much water is left? How long until the next well? She began to ration, giving Ishmael most of it, sacrificing her own hydration. But the desert sun is a relentless collector. The goatskin water skin withered, becoming light and flabby, until the last drop was squeezed into the boy's dry mouth. Thirst in the desert is not just discomfort, it is systemic agony. The tongue swells, the skin cracks, the mind begins to hallucinate. Ishmael, though young and strong, succumbed first. Perhaps the emotional shock of rejection undermined his physical resistance. He fainted. Hagar had to carry or drag her son, the wild man, now reduced to a dead weight from fever and dehydration. We then arrive at the scene that opened our story, but now with the depth of context. Hagar finds a bush, a gnarled acacia or a broom, and throws the boy there. The verb to throw suggests that her strength is gone. She didn't place him gently. She let him go because she couldn't bear it any longer. The shade of the bush was the only mercy the world had to offer. And then, the final decision, separation. Hagar moves away, a bow shot away. This measure of distance is both poetic and tragic. It is the distance of violence, a bow is a weapon, but also the distance of powerlessness. She wanted to be close enough to protect him from wild beasts, but far enough away not to hear his final cries. It is the geometry of despair, neither too close nor too far. She sat on the scorching ground and lifted up her voice and wept. That weeping was not a prayer, it was a primal howl of pain. She didn't call upon Abraham nor Sarah nor even God at that moment. She wept for the injustice of it all. Why was she brought from Egypt? Why was she used? Why was a promise given if the end was that dry bush? The Beersheba desert became the tomb of her hope. Hagar was ready to die. She closed her eyes, hoping the heat would take her, hoping the final silence would swallow the tragedy of her existence. She didn't know that, just a few meters away, reality was about to be torn apart, not by death, but by the voice of the one whose name she thought she had forgotten. While Hagar sobbed with her face buried in the hot dust, believing her cries were the only sound in that vast emptiness, another frequency was being picked up in the heavenly courts. The biblical text makes a fascinating and crucial distinction. Hagar raised her voice and cried, "But God heard the voice of the boy." Why the boy? Ishmael, whose name literally means God hears, was dying. Perhaps he was already too weak to cry out. Perhaps his cry was merely a dehydrated groan, a whisper of agony. Yet it was this sound, the sound of the life that Abraham had discarded, that moved heaven. There is a profound theology here. Hagar's prayer was tainted by despair and the resignation of death, but Ishmael's groan was the pure claim of life. God honored the name he himself had given the boy 13 years earlier. He could not let die the one who carried in his identity the promise that God hears. The angel of God calls out from heaven, and the first thing he does is not offer water, but offer perspective. What is the matter, Hagar? This divine question does not seek information, for God knew exactly what she had, or what she did not have. The question served to pull Hagar out of the emotional trance of anticipatory grief. God calls her by name, not slave, not Egyptian, but Hagar. In that moment of total abandonment, being called by name was the first sip of living water her soul drank. It meant that she had not disappeared from the divine map, even though she had been erased from Abraham's map. The angel's next command defies all logic. Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. The phrase, "where he is vital. Where was he? Under a bush, rejected, dying outside the promised land, in the middle of nowhere. God was telling Hagar that his presence is not restricted to the altars of Abraham or the tents of Isaac. God can hear and act where he is, whether in a hospital bed, in a prison cell, or in the desert of Beersheba. The geographical location of Ishmael's pain became the address of God's providence. The angel then gives an order of action that demands a strength Hagar thought she no longer possessed. Get up, lift the boy up, and take him by the hand. God was returning to Hagar the maternal responsibility she had abdicated by moving away a bowshot. He was saying, "Do not give up on him while I have not given up on you." Hagar had to wipe away her tears, rise with trembling legs, and return to the place of death to transform it into a place of resurrection. She had to touch the feverish boy, take that inert hand, and transmit to him the strength of the renewed promise. I will make him a great nation. Hagar's healing began not when she drank water, but when she rose to fight for her son's life, obeying the voice that contradicted all visual evidence of the end. The climax of divine intervention was not the creation of a river in the desert, but the correction of a woman's vision. Verse 19 of Genesis 21 says, "Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water." Notice the terrifying and wonderful subtlety of this text. The well was already there. God didn't dig the well at that instant. He didn't make it rain. The provision was physically available, accessible, just a few meters from where she mourned the death of her son. Hagar's problem was never the absence of resources, but the blindness caused by grief. Despair has the evil power to create a spiritual and emotional cataract that prevents us from seeing the way out that is within our reach. Hagar was so focused on the bush of death and the distance of farewell that she became blind to the topography of grace around her. How many times do we die of thirst beside a well because we are too busy crying over what we have lost, unable to open our eyes to what we still have? God's action was ophthalmological. He removed the scales of panic. When Hagar saw the well, the adrenaline of survival replaced the lethargy of depression. The narrative describes a sequence of quick and decisive actions. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Hagar took the same skin that Abraham had given her, the skin that represented scarcity and human limitations, and filled it at God's source, which represents inexhaustible abundance. That empty skin, which minutes before was the symbol of her failure, became the instrument of salvation. She ran to Ishmael, lifted his head, and poured life onto his cracked lips. Seeing the color return to her son's face, seeing his eyes open, seeing his breathing stabilize, was Hagar's true revenge against the death decreed by Sarah. At that moment, Hagar understood that God's provision does not depend on the generosity of men. Abraham may have given little, but God completed everything. She learned that to survive the desert, it is not enough to cry. One must have open eyes to recognize the hidden resources that God has planted in the barren landscape. That well of Beersheba did not save just 2 physical bodies. It saved the faith of an entire lineage, proving that the God who sees, El Roi, is also the God who shows. After surviving in Beersheba, Hagar made the conscious decision not to seek a way back, neither to immediate Egypt nor to Canaan. The text says that they dwelt in the desert of Paran. Paran is a vast, mountainous and harsh region located on the Sinai Peninsula. It is a place where civilization does not reach, where the laws of Abraham and the customs of Sarah have no jurisdiction. Choosing to live there was an act of sovereignty. Hagar and Ishmael founded their own kingdom in exile. There, the boy grew up. The biblical text says, God was with the young man. This phrase is a slap in the face of exclusivist theology. God did not remain confined to Isaac's tent. He walked through the dunes of Paran with the rejected one. Ishmael became an archer. The choice of this profession is not accidental. The bow is the weapon of distance, defense, and independence. Unlike a shepherd, like Abraham, who needs to care for vulnerable sheep, or a farmer who depends on rain, the archer is a hunter, a solitary warrior who masters his environment. Ishmael channeled his pain and rejection into skill. Each arrow he fired was an affirmation of his existence. I am here. I am strong. I don't need my father's inheritance to survive. Hagar watched this transformation. She saw the frightened boy under the bush transform into the master of the desert. She raised him to be free, never again to depend on anyone's pity. Life in Paran was undoubtedly hard. They didn't have the luxuries of the patriarchal tent. They didn't have abundant livestock, but they had something worth more: the absence of contempt. No one looked at Ishmael as second best. No one looked at Hagar as the slave. In Paran, they were the royalty of the sand. Hagar became the queen mother of a nascent tribe, teaching Ishmael the lessons of survival: how to find water, how to read the wind, how to trust only in God and the strength of his own arm. The prophecy that he would be a wild donkey was fulfilled not as a curse of brutality, but as a promise of untamedness. He could not be tamed or enslaved. The pedagogy of the desert forged a man who, though separated from the covenant of messianic promise, was blessed with the promise of temporal greatness and non-negotiable freedom. The final arc of Hagar's story is an act of supreme matriarchal autonomy. When Ishmael reaches adulthood, the question of marriage arises. In the patriarchal culture of the ancient Near East, it was the father's exclusive duty to choose a wife for his son, as Abraham would later do for Isaac, sending for Rebekah. But Abraham wasn't there. He had abdicated that right the day he placed the wineskin on Hagar's shoulder. So Hagar assumes the role. The text says, "And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt." Hagar didn't seek a wife among the daughters of Canaan, nor did she try to reconnect with Abraham's family in Haran. She looked south. She looked to her roots. By seeking an Egyptian wife for Ishmael, Hagar was making a powerful cultural statement. We are not rejected Hebrews. We are a new nation with ancient roots. She reconnected Ishmael with the heritage she herself had left behind so many years before. This marriage marked the closing of Hagar's cycle. The girl who was taken from Egypt as a slave now returned to Egypt a free prince to seek an alliance. She ensured that Ishmael's blood would not be diluted in the land of his exile, but strengthened with the dignity of his ancestors. It was an act of identity healing. Hagar rejected the culture that rejected her. She did not allow Ishmael to become a cultural beggar on the periphery of Canaan. By marrying him to an Egyptian woman, she consolidated Ishmaelite identity as distinct, proud, and independent. Hagar, the slave who was silenced, abused, and expelled, ends her biblical narrative making executive decisions that would shape the demographics of the Middle East forever. She did not die as a victim under a bush. She lived long enough to see her grandchildren, to see God's promise fulfilled in real time, a great nation. And then, the last image we have of Hagar is not that of a weeping woman, but of a matriarch who knew how to build a future where there was none, proving that God's blessing is capable of transforming exile into empire. Many years after that cold morning of expulsion, a solemn event forced the diverging paths to cross again. Genesis 25:9 gives us information that is both historical and healing. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him, Abraham, in the cave of Machpelah. This verse is a mountain of emotional significance. Abraham died at 175 years old and full of days. But who was there to close his eyes? Not only the son of the promise, Isaac, the heir who remained in the tent, but also Ishmael, the son of the desert who was expelled. Imagine the scene. Ishmael receives the news of his father's death there in the sands of Paran. He is now a grown man, a warrior, a clan chief, married to an Egyptian woman, a father of children. That frail boy who almost died of thirst now returns not as a beggar, but as an equal. The biblical text places the two names side by side, Isaac and Ishmael. There is no mention of hostility, no record of war between them at that sacred time. Hagar, the mother who shaped this man, must have played a crucial role in this decision to return. Only a mother who had healed her own wounds could raise a son capable of returning to bury the father who had rejected him. Ishmael's return to Abraham's funeral is the ultimate proof of the success of Hagar's upbringing. She did not raise a bitter son, trapped in the cycle of hatred. She raised a man secure enough to pay his last respects without feeling diminished. There, in the cave of Machpelah, before the motionless body of the patriarch who had caused so much pain and so much blessing, the two brothers look at each other. Isaac, the man of meditation and peace, and Ishmael, the man of the bow and freedom. They represent two worlds, two alliances, two destinies. But in that instant, they are united by the shared humanity of orphanhood. This moment of silent reconciliation is Hagar's invisible legacy. She allowed Ishmael to be free, even to forgive. Ishmael's presence at the funeral validates God's promise that he would not be forgotten. Abraham died surrounded by the two fruits of his womb, proving that God's grace is capable of mending the loose ends of a dysfunctional family, even if it is on the brink of a grave. To understand the spiritual magnitude of Hagar, we need to leap 2 millennia into the future and enter the mind of the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, Paul performs a shocking exegesis that transforms Hagar's biography into a fundamental theology of Christianity. He says that Hagar and Sarah are an allegory. Hagar corresponds to Mount Sinai in Arabia and represents the covenant of the law, which generates slavery. Sarah corresponds to the heavenly Jerusalem and represents the covenant of grace, which generates freedom. At first glance, this may seem harsh on Hagar, associating her with slavery. But if we look with spiritual microscopy, we will see the immense dignity that Paul confers upon her. Hagar becomes the symbol of all human effort to reach God through works, the flesh and the law. She represents the tangible, harsh and demanding reality of Mount Sinai. Why is this important? Because Hagar, in her pain and struggle, personified humanity's attempt to produce blessing with its own hands. When Abraham and Sarah tried to help God using Hagar, they were operating in the flesh, and what is born of the flesh is flesh. Paul uses Hagar's story to warn us. We cannot mix the freedom of the spirit with the slavery of religious performance. Hagar therefore serves as a divine mirror to show us the insufficiency of our efforts. She bore the weight of the law, human effort, so that we could understand the need for grace, the divine gift. In this sense, Hagar is an essential pedagogical figure. Without her story, we would not understand the crucial difference between the son of the slave woman, born of natural effort, and the son of the free woman, born of supernatural power. Hagar, even though used as a symbol of the Old Covenant, renders an eternal service to the New Covenant, showing us that true inheritance is not earned by the sweat of one's brow or by human strategy, but is received through promise, faith, and miracle. She is the guardian of the boundary between the religion of doing and the gospel of receiving, and her story continues to liberate people today who try in vain to please God through their own merits, reminding them that we are only free when we are born of promise and not of slavery. The Bible leaves no loose ends, and Hagar's story doesn't end in a vacuum. In Genesis 25, right after Abraham's death, Scripture pauses solemnly to list Ishmael's genealogy. And what do we find there? The literal and exact fulfillment of the promise made to Hagar in the desert. God had said, "He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make them into a great nation," Genesis 17-20. And there they are, name by name: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibzam, Mishma, Dumah, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names according to their villages and their fortresses. 12 princes according to their families. Note the language, villages and fortresses. Hagar didn't beget miserable nomads. She begat builders of civilizations, founders of cities, leaders of territories. That woman who was evicted and left homeless watched her grandchildren build castles. That woman who had no land watched her descendants rule from Havilah to Shur. This final chapter is Hagar's vindication. God kept his word. He didn't need Sarah's permission or Abraham's help to make Ishmael a great man. He did it in the desert, far from the eyes of the official covenant. Ishmael's 12 princes are a historical monument to God's faithfulness to a single foreign mother. They prove that God is able to bless abundantly outside of traditional religious structures. Hagar the Egyptian became the mother of powerful nations, and her cultural and genetic legacy irrevocably shaped the Middle East. When we look at the list of these 12 names, we shouldn't just see an ancient genealogy. We should see 12 trophies of God's grace, 12 proofs that Hagar's cry was heard, 12 reminders that when God says, "I see you," He is not just passively observing, but is actively orchestrating a future of greatness that far surpasses our capacity to imagine in the moment of pain. Hagar won. She defeated Sarah not through competition, but through survival and fruition. She conquered death. She conquered oblivion. Hagar's biography is, ultimately, a revelation that God is the God of the margins. The story of redemption usually focuses on the center, on Jerusalem, the temple, the lineage of David. But Hagar reminds us that God is also working powerfully on the periphery, in the desert, on the frontiers, among the Gentiles and the rejected. She inaugurates a category of faith for those who don't fit into the system. If Sarah is the mother of those born within the promise, Hagar is the patron saint of those who found God outside the gates. Her life dismantles the arrogance of those who think they have a monopoly on God. She teaches us that the Spirit blows where it wills, and that sometimes the purest water is not in Abraham's well, but in the spring that God opens for the weeping slave. Hagar leaves us with the challenging certainty that our wounds are not the end of our story, but the soil where God plants His greatest miracles. If you have been expelled, if you have been replaced, if you have felt the weight of the empty wineskin on your shoulder, remember Hagar. Remember that the desert is not the end of the line. It is merely the necessary space for you to stop listening to the voices of men who diminish you and begin to listen to the voice of the God who exalts you. May the courage of this Egyptian woman run in your veins, and may you have the audacity to lift your eyes, see the well, fill the wineskin, and walk towards your own empire. Perhaps, upon hearing Hagar's story today, you felt an echo in your own soul. Perhaps you are experiencing your own moment of expulsion, feeling the pain of being left behind by people you loved or trusted. I want to tell you something with all the certainty of my heart. You are not invisible. Hagar's God El Roi is looking at you at this very moment, and He doesn't see an outcast. He sees a prince. He sees a nation. He sees a future that no one can cancel. If this message was the well of water you needed in your desert today, I ask that you do 3 simple but powerful things. First, subscribe to the channel. We are building a community here of people who, like Hagar, have decided to survive and thrive. Second, leave a like. This helps this message reach other Ishmaels and Hagars who are dying of spiritual thirst around the world. And third, and most importantly, write in the comments, God sees me. Let's fill this comment section with a public declaration of faith, creating a monument of witnesses who know they are not alone. Take your wineskin, wipe away your tears, and stand up. Your desert is only the beginning of your great nation. May the peace of the Lord, which surpasses all understanding, guard your heart. Until the next video.